Welcome, age of vintage society. An American icon, Buster Keaton is easily acknowledged as one of the greatest filmmakers in early cinema and beyond. His elaborate slapstick made audiences scream with laughter, but his stone face hid an internal turmoil. Was Buster Keaton forbidden to smile? Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. The Great Stone Face of Hollywood. Buster made his name as a child of vaudeville, thrown around the stage by his father in a cartoon pantomime of very real abuse. The lessons he carried forward from that experience translated into some of the greatest silent films of all time. Keaton wrote, directed, performed and edited dozens of features and shorts, including his masterpiece, The General. However, those early scars also led to decades of drinking and mistreatment of women. Keaton saw huge successes, Hollywood sex scandals, years of neglect from studios and audiences, and finally a shaky resurrection that assured his place in Hollywood's film canon. Keaton understood that accidents happen. Watch any Buster Keaton film and you'll find the actor loved to play accident-prone characters, but they remained unfazed, even in the wake of disastrous situations. His characters always found a way to turn crazy situations into happy endings. He branded himself as a Hollywood pioneer. Other comedians of the silent film era had acts similar to Keaton, amusing chase scenes being left behind by a variety of vehicles, but he found a way to stand out. Part of what made Keaton's act so distinct was his stone face. While other silent film actors relied on dramatic expressions to convey their stories, Keaton kept his face still, but this never detracted from the quality of his films. In fact, it enhanced his work. His characters were known for their ability to adapt to any situation, pioneering his own brand of comedy. No comedy fan or film buff should miss this insider story of the man behind the stone face. By age 9, Buster Keaton already knew he should never smile. I'd simply learned that I was the type of comic that if I laughed at what I did, the audience didn't. Keaton tells Telescope's Fletcher Markle, reflecting on his early years in vaudeville in this 1964 profile. From his christening as Buster by Harry Houdini to tips on how to throw a pie and keep his saucer-brimmed pork pie hat in shape, this profile captures the man behind the great stone face and evokes the long-gone early years of cinematic comedy. Buster Keaton's famous unsmiling face was a contractual obligation. His contract with MGM precluded him from smiling on screen. It's a testimony to the power and effectiveness of film studio publicity departments during the heyday of the studio system in the 1930s and 1940s that much of the apocryphal information they concocted and propagated for publicity's sake continues to be cited as fact many decades later. News was frequently imparted by studio PR departments simply to keep actors' names before the public, with little regard for the accuracy of the information. Making up and releasing bits of inventive fiction about actors was considered a perfectly legitimate way of maintaining fan interest. Colourful tales about stars' backgrounds or fabricated tidbits about remarkable but benign aspects of their private lives were common fodder for the publicity machine, as were rumours of unusual contract specifications, that a particular actor was obligated by the terms of his or her contract to remain unmarried, to maintain a weight above or below a specified figure, to learn foreign languages, or to refrain from singing or smiling in public. One of the more frequently repeated examples of these rumours, as cited in the example above, is the contention that silent film star Buster Keaton was precluded from smiling on screen by the terms of his contract, another of those bits of PR apocrypha that continues its tenacious hold as a piece of true Hollywood lore several decades on. On October 4th, 1895, Buster, the great stone-face Keaton, was born as Joseph Frank Keaton in Pica, Kansas, the small town where his mother, a dancer and singer, was where she went into labour. Keaton was born into a vaudeville family. His father, also Joseph, was a performer and actor who worked with Harry Houdini. As legend has it, he earned the name of Buster when he was 18 months old, after falling down a flight of stairs. Magician Harry Houdini scooped up the child and, turning to the boy's parents, quipped, "That was a real Buster." His other nickname, the Great Stone Face, related to his stoic demeanour. He wasn't quite deadpan, but his expressions were infinitesimal, minimalist reactions to often cataclysmic events. Buster himself joined the family business and began performing with his parents on stage at the age of 3. They were known as the Three Keatons. The Three Keatons specialised in knockabout acrobatics, with Joe using little Buster as a human mop. Already accustomed to taking pratfalls without suffering injury, Buster learned how to get laughs at a very early age. He also discovered that the more serious I turned, the bigger laugh I got, and accordingly adopted his trademark deadpan expression. Keaton quickly grew used to being knocked around a bit, working with his parents in an act that prided itself on being as rough as it was funny. Keaton was frequently tossed around by his father. During these performances, Keaton would learn to display the deadpan look that would later become a hallmark of his comedy career. "It was the roughest knockout act that was ever in the history of the theatre," he later said of the performances he did with his parents. Remaining with the family act until age 21, he was hired to appear solo in the Broadway revue The Passing Show of 1917 at a salary of $250 per week. He did not make that engagement, however. Just before rehearsals started, Buster was invited to play a small role in The Butcher Boy, a two-reel comedy film directed by and starring Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle. He only went solo after Arbuckle was embroiled in a notorious Hollywood scandal that saw him blacklisted by Hollywood, despite his eventual and apparently correct acquittal on a rape and manslaughter charge. While remaining fiercely loyal to his mentor, Buster announced his independence with the dazzling short, 1 week, in which his newlywed attempts to put together a house with inspired and outlandish results. The climatic train gag is the stuff of legend. Fascinated with the technical aspects and creative possibilities of the movie medium, Keaton went to work for Arbuckle as a supporting player at a weekly salary of $40. He spent the next 2 years learning every facet of motion picture comedy, an invaluable training program interrupted only by his military service during World War I. During his service, Keaton banded together with a few fellow soldiers and formed the Sunshine Players. They performed vaudeville for different regiments, and Keaton always took centre stage. His main pull was a routine called the Snake Dance. He would dress up as an Egyptian and pretend a line of sausage links was a snake, which he would charm. His routine was so successful that officers repeatedly requested him to perform. The generous Arbuckle not only bestowed full co-star status on Keaton, but also welcomed Buster's participation in the creation of gags and scenarios. In addition, the two co-directed The Rough House, a comedy short in which they also starred. When Arbuckle graduated to feature films, his producer Joseph M. Schenck arranged for Keaton to inherit Fatty's production staff, and in 1920 Keaton launched his own two-reel series with the brilliant 1 Week. Though he often referred to his film alter ego as Old Slow Thinker, Keaton's screen character possessed remarkable resourcefulness, but he was also a fatalist, resigned to the fact that the world was against him. Wasting no pity on himself, he neither expected nor solicited any sympathy from the audience. Even when his character won, he refused to allow himself the luxury of a smile, as if certain that still more trouble lay ahead. Perhaps because Keaton eschewed the pathos of Charlie Chaplin and the ebullient optimism of Harold Lloyd, his silent features never made as much money as those of his two biggest box office rivals. For the same reasons, however, most of Keaton's silence have stood the test of time far better than those of his contemporaries. Many of his best gags were as ingenious as they were amusing, encouraging audiences to think as well as grin. His early work is littered with incredible stunt work. The only time he ever used a double was in Sherlock Jr., in which he was forced to play the policeman chasing his own character, because that stunt was more dangerous. Keaton's sense of cinematic innovation was as dazzling as his athleticism and physical bravery. In The Playhouse, he spoofed his rival Thomas Ince, who had a habit of crediting himself extensively by playing 25 different parts. It was shot by covering part of the camera lens to film on just one section of the celluloid, then rewinding the film, covering a different part and shooting the next. In Sherlock Jr., his dozing cinema projectionist entered the film he was screening. Later, he literally jumps through a man. Over the next nearly 50 years, Keaton became one of Hollywood's most famous faces, starring in nearly 150 pictures, many of which he also wrote and/or directed. Among those films was 1926's The General, which Orson Welles deemed one of the greatest films ever made. Unfortunately, the advent of sound films and the onset of the Great Depression resulted in Keaton's losing his independence as a filmmaker. In 1928, Keaton's production company was signed over to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the biggest of the Hollywood studios. Keaton was at the mercy of MGM's army of producers, supervisors and screenwriters whose efforts to improve his brand of humour virtually destroyed it. Most of his talkies for MGM were burdened with banal storylines, superfluous characters and tired wisecracks. Even though these films made money, Keaton's frustration grew, and he soon developed a drinking problem, culminating in his dismissal from MGM in 1933. He starred in a series of films which were ill-suited to his unique talents, and afforded him little opportunity for creative input. He was reduced to acting in bit parts, serving as an uncredited gag writer, and working as an assistant director until stage appearances and a renewed interest in his silent film work sparked a Buster Keaton revival in the 1950s, culminating in the production of a 1957 feature film biography, The Buster Keaton Story, which sadly had little in common with the real events of Buster Keaton's life. Pulling himself out of the doldrums, he spent the next 2 decades rebuilding his life and reputation, starring in cheap two-reel comedies, playing minor screen roles, touring in summer stock and working as a comedy writer. A series of live appearances at Paris's Cirque Medrano beginning in 1947 led to a full-scale comeback and a major renewal of interest in his silent output. Once talkies arrived in the late 1920s, Keaton's star began to wane. His life after sound came in is often painted brutally, as he no longer had the control of his films he had during the silent era, and his personal life hit some rocky and difficult times. Though in 1930 Keaton faced being washed up at 35, the second half of his life was full, if not as successful, and he lived to see his silent films rediscovered and appreciated. Allowing these difficulties to overwhelm the final assessment is unfair, however, as the Keaton canon is an astounding accomplishment for one lifetime. But in the 1940s and 1950s he made a comeback with feature films and starring on TV shows. In 1959 Keaton received an honorary Oscar. The sheer ability of his acrobatics astounded audiences who had become used to less sophisticated physical comedy, and by the 1960s his films were returning to the theatres and he was being hailed as the greatest actor of the silent era. After meeting MGM contract dancer Eleanor Norris in 1938, he married the much younger woman. She was 23, he was 44, in 1940. Their marriage was a happy one that lasted 26 years until his death. His career spanned 6 decades and touched the lives of millions of people. He had worked with everyone from Marlene Dietrich to Samuel Beckett, Cecil B. DeMille to Tony Randall, and had maintained a seemingly selfless composure throughout. For many, this deadpan style was a poignant reminder of the fragility of life in the age of complex and overwhelming machines. Today, more than 30 years after his death, Buster Keaton's films seem as funny, touching and relevant as ever. Keaton developed an enduring legacy in entertainment. Entertainment Weekly described him as the 7th greatest director of all time, and the American Film Institute claimed him as the 21st greatest male star of all time. He passed away on February 1st, 1966, from lung cancer. Along with Harold Lloyd and Charlie Chaplin, Keaton is known for being one of the 3 great silent-era comedians. Even today, Keaton's unique comedic stylings continue to influence many filmmakers. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. Now it is your turn. What do you think about the life and legacy of Buster Keaton? He reminds us that the dream might not always be achieved, but there are bound to be some laughs along the way.